For nearly 5 decades, Graceland stood frozen in time, honoring Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll.
For 48 years, one door at Graceland never opened. Not for tour guides, not for presidents, not even for the family members who walked past it 1,000 times on their way through the mansion. Behind that door sat a narrow staircase, and at the top of that staircase sat an attic that nobody living had set foot inside since the summer of 1977. Fans who paid for the full Graceland tour would crane their necks toward the roofline, wondering what could possibly be worth locking away for half a century. Was it nothing, just boxes of Christmas decorations and broken furniture? Or was it something the Presley family never wanted the world to see? In this video, we're going to walk through the real story of Graceland, the real story of how Elvis Presley died, the very real attempt by con artists to steal the house out from under his family, and the question everyone keeps asking: what was finally found when that attic door swung open? Stick around, because the answer is stranger, sadder, and more human than anyone expected. In March of 1957, a 22-year-old singer from Tupelo, Mississippi walked through the gates of a colonial-style mansion on the edge of Memphis and decided, almost on the spot, that this was home. Elvis Presley paid just over $100,000 for the property, a staggering sum for a performer barely 2 years into stardom, but pocket change compared to what he'd earn in the years that followed. The estate already carried name Graceland, given by a previous owner in honor of a family member. Elvis never bothered to change it. Something about the name must have felt right, because he kept it exactly as he found it. At first, Graceland was simply a place to escape the noise. Elvis had grown up poor in cramped two-room houses, and now he owned nearly 14 acres with rolling lawns, horse pastures, and enough room to finally breathe. He filled the stables with horses and gave the property something close to a working farm's rhythm. He also filled it with people: his parents, his cousins, his friends from Memphis, and eventually his own strange menagerie of pets, including a chimpanzee that became almost as famous as some of his backup singers for causing chaos at parties. But Graceland wasn't static. As Elvis's fame and his moods shifted through the 60s and 70s, so did the house. He carved out a meditation garden with white columns and a fountain, a quiet corner where he could sit without cameras or fans pressing against the fence. He also indulged his more theatrical instincts: a den with shag carpet climbing up the walls, a basement television room wired to run 3 sets at once so he'd never miss a show, and a racquetball building out back where he could burn off restless energy in the middle of the night. Graceland, in other words, was never just a house. It was a physical map of who Elvis Presley actually was underneath the rhinestones, a boy from Tupelo who never quite got comfortable with how big his life had become, and who built himself a private world inside the public one. By the summer of 1977, the man walking those halls looked very different from the lean, restless performer who'd bought the house 2 decades earlier. Elvis was 42 years old, and the years had not been gentle. His weight had crept upward. His stage shows, once electric, had become unpredictable. Some nights brilliant, other nights marked by slurred introductions and songs that trailed off mid-verse. Fans who loved him tried not to notice. People closer to him could no longer look away. On the morning of August 16, 1977, Elvis was, by most accounts, behaving normally for him. Up late, sleeping through the heat of the day, planning a flight out of Memphis that evening. Sometime in the early afternoon, he was found unresponsive in an upstairs bathroom. Members of his staff attempted CPR while paramedics were called, and he was rushed to Baptist Memorial Hospital. Efforts to revive him continued for nearly an hour. By mid-afternoon, doctors pronounced him dead. The official cause of death, announced to the public that evening, was cardiac arrhythmia. In plain terms, his heart had simply stopped. That explanation was true as far as it went, but it left out almost everything that mattered. A more complete toxicology report, released later, showed multiple prescription substances in his system at levels far beyond what any single patient should have been taking. The full picture that emerged in the months and years afterward described a heart under enormous strain, a body worn down by years of heavy prescription use, and a medical system around Elvis that had, for a long time, been more willing to prescribe than to intervene. At the center of that system was his longtime personal physician, a man Elvis and his circle called Dr. Nick. Over the final months of Elvis's life, prescriptions issued in his name numbered in the thousands of pills, sedatives, stimulants, and painkillers, often overlapping in ways that should have raised alarms. The doctor would later defend himself by arguing that he was managing genuine, chronic health problems and trying to keep Elvis away from more dangerous, unsupervised sources. A jury ultimately declined to convict him of criminal wrongdoing. But medical regulators in Tennessee reached a different conclusion years later, stripping him of his license for good. None of that made the loss any less devastating to the people who loved him, or to the tens of thousands of fans who converged on Memphis in the days after his death, lining the streets in the August heat just to say goodbye to a voice that had shaped their lives. Elvis was laid to rest beside his mother, and for a moment, it seemed like Graceland's story might finally settle into something quieter. It didn't. Just 2 days after the funeral, a break-in attempt at the cemetery where Elvis was buried made it brutally clear that even in death, he wasn't going to be left in peace. Fearing further attempts, his father Vernon arranged for both Elvis and his mother to be reburied within the grounds of Graceland itself, inside the same meditation garden Elvis had built years earlier as a retreat from the world. It was a decision made out of grief and fear in equal measure, and it changed the character of the house permanently. Security tightened. Certain rooms were sealed off entirely, and the entire upper floor of the mansion, including the primary bedroom, the bathroom where Elvis had died, and the attic above it, was closed to everyone outside the immediate family. When Graceland opened its doors to paying visitors in 1982, the tour was carefully choreographed to keep guests on the ground floor. People could see the kitchen where Elvis made his famous late-night sandwiches, the mirrored stairwell, the jungle-themed den, even stand at his grave in the garden. But the staircase leading upstairs stayed roped off, decade after decade, tour after tour, with guides offering the same gentle explanation. The upstairs is private, out of respect for the family. For millions of visitors over the following decades, that unreachable second floor became part of Graceland's mystique. It was the one place in a house otherwise fully open to public consumption that remained genuinely unknown. And naturally, where there's a locked door and a beloved icon, rumors tend to fill the silence. Almost from the moment Elvis's death was announced, stories began circulating that he hadn't actually died at all. The first alleged sighting reportedly came within hours, involving a man who resembled Elvis boarding a flight out of Memphis under a name Elvis had genuinely used while traveling incognito. Within weeks, more sightings followed. A woman in Michigan swore she'd been served by him at a fast food counter. A gas station attendant in Oklahoma claimed to recognize him despite a disguise. And by the end of a decade, tabloids were running regular features just to keep track of the volume of claims. Theories multiplied over the years, ranging from the merely eccentric to the genuinely elaborate. Some believers argued Elvis had cooperated with federal investigators against organized crime and vanished into witness protection. Others insisted he'd simply grown tired of fame and staged his own death to escape it. Supporters of these theories pointed to oddities around the funeral, a closed casket after fans had already been allowed to view him, and a misspelling of his middle name on the gravestone that some insisted the family would never have gotten wrong by accident. The internet gave these theories a second life. Amateur audio analysts spent hours comparing his voice to obscure singers and radio preachers, convinced they'd found him hiding in plain sight. Even now, decades later, small online communities keep the theories alive, trading half-serious sightings and grainy photographs. It's tempting to treat all of this as harmless fandom, and mostly it is. But there's something worth noticing underneath the jokes and conspiracy boards. The Elvis is alive myth, in its own strange way, lets everyone off the hook. It's easier to imagine him sipping coffee under an assumed name somewhere than to sit with the plainer, sadder truth, that a phenomenally talented man was surrounded by people who kept supplying him with what was slowly killing him, and that his death, unlike the myth, was entirely preventable. Nothing about Graceland's story, though, prepared fans for what happened in the spring of 2024, a plot so brazen that even seasoned true crime followers struggled to believe it was real. A public notice appeared in a Memphis newspaper announcing that a company almost nobody had heard of, calling itself Nosany Investments and Private Lending, intended to foreclose on Graceland and auction the estate to the highest bidder within weeks. The claim behind the notice was audacious, that Lisa Marie Presley had, years before her death, borrowed close to $4 million against Graceland as collateral and never repaid it. Riley Keough, Lisa Marie's daughter, and the person who inherited control of the Presley estate after her mother's passing in January 2023, was blindsided. Her legal team moved immediately, filing suit in Tennessee to block the sale, arguing that the loan documents were fabricated and that her mother's signature had been forged. The evidence backing that claim turned out to be damning. The notary public whose name appeared on the loan paperwork stated plainly that she had never met Lisa Marie Presley, let alone notarized anything on her behalf. With the sale scheduled to proceed within days, a Tennessee chancellor granted an emergency injunction, halting the auction less than 24 hours before it was set to happen. The judge noted that the evidence strongly suggested fraud, and that allowing the sale to proceed would cause irreparable harm, not just to the Presley family, but to a piece of American cultural history. What followed was a slow unraveling. Investigators traced the scheme back to a Missouri woman named Lisa Janine Finley, who had reportedly posed under several invented identities, including a fictional business owner and a fictional attorney, to pressure the Presley family into a multi-million-dollar settlement rather than risk losing the estate outright. When the plan collapsed under legal scrutiny, Finley initially tried to shift blame onto an invented overseas fraud ring before investigators closed in. She was arrested on federal charges in August 2024, pleaded guilty to mail fraud the following year, and was ultimately sentenced to nearly 5 years in federal prison. It remains one of the strangest true crime footnotes in Elvis history. A woman with a long record of scams nearly convinced a court, however briefly, that she had legal standing to sell off one of the most visited private homes in the United States. And in a strange way, the crisis did something no family decision had managed to do in almost 50 years. It pushed Riley Keough to think seriously for the first time about what should happen to everything inside Graceland that had never been cataloged, protected, or even properly seen, including the sealed-off second floor her family had left untouched since the week her great-grandfather died. What follows is where verified history gives way to legend, the kind of story fans have whispered about Graceland's attic for decades, filled in over the years with imagination as much as fact, since the family itself has never released a public inventory of what, if anything, sits behind that door. Take it in that spirit, not as a documented archive, but as the myth that's grown up around the one part of Elvis's world nobody has ever been allowed to see. According to that legend, when the door was finally opened, what greeted the handful of people allowed inside wasn't chaos or clutter. It was order, the kind of order that suggested someone had deliberately organized the space long before it was sealed. Rows of boxes, each labeled by hand, supposedly sorted Elvis's life into chapters. His childhood in Tupelo, his earliest recordings, his years in the Army, his Hollywood period, his final Las Vegas residencies. The story goes that one box, simply marked with the year of his death, sat apart from the rest, as though someone had known it would eventually need its own place. The legend describes a battered childhood teddy bear, patched with scraps of fabric by his mother during the leanest years of his boyhood. It describes a worn family Bible, its spine held together with tape, filled with margin notes and questions scribbled in Elvis's own hand. It describes a high school yearbook signed by classmates who once teased a shy, oddly dressed kid for looking different. The same kid who would go on to change American music forever. Whether every detail of that story is literally true is impossible to verify, and the Presley family has kept the actual contents of the second floor private. But the story persists for a reason. It captures something people already sense about Elvis Presley, that behind the jumpsuits and the gold records was a man who spent a lot of his short life trying to hold on to pieces of who he'd been before any of it happened to him. Strip away the sightings, the conspiracy boards, and the half-verified attic legends, and what's left is a more grounded, more human story. Elvis Presley was a working-class kid from Mississippi who became, almost overnight, one of the most famous human beings on the planet, a level of fame the world hadn't fully learned how to handle yet, let alone a 20-something from Tupelo. He built himself a fortress at Graceland not because he wanted to hide from the world, but because he needed somewhere the world couldn't follow him in. The tragedy of his final years wasn't mysterious or hidden behind locked doors. It was documented in plain sight, in prescription records, in medical board hearings, in the testimony of people who loved him and watched him struggle. The Elvis is alive theories, the sealed attic, the auction scandal. All of it has kept people talking about Graceland for nearly 50 years. But none of it changes the central simple fact. A 30-something turned 40-something man who reshaped popular music died far too young, in a house he built to protect himself, surrounded by people who should have protected him better. What the Graceland story ultimately offers isn't a shocking twist or a hidden survivor waiting behind a locked door. It's a portrait of fame at its most double-edged, a house filled with gold records and rhinestone jumpsuits on the ground floor. And if the legend of that upstairs attic is to be believed, quieter, more fragile pieces of a boy from Tupelo tucked away above it, kept out of sight not because they were shameful, but because they were the most honest things Elvis Presley ever owned. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the real and rumored history of Graceland, let us know in the comments. And stick around for more stories from the world of classic music history.